The cockpit of a P-51 Mustang at 12,000 feet is a coffin waiting to be sealed. Dr. Robert Kellerman knew this because he had watched it happen 17 times in 3 months. American pilots climbing toward German fighters, ascending into a death they did not understand. Most were younger than his own son. They died not in glorious moments of honor, but in the brutal mathematics of physics, in the cold calculation of force, mass, and the human body's absolute limit to withstand acceleration. 17 young men. 17 names read aloud at ceremonies. 17 families receiving telegrams. The Germans had discovered something American tacticians had not yet admitted, that air combat was not about courage or marksmanship, it was about physics, and it was costing lives at an unsustainable rate. Dr. Robert Edmund Kellerman was 53 years old when Colonel Harrison brought him to the airbase in East Anglia. A physics teacher from Princeton, he had spent 30 years studying forces, vectors, and the behavior of objects through space. His hands were soft. His eyes were weak behind thick glasses. He had never fired a weapon, never worn a uniform, never killed anything larger than a spider in his laboratory. He smoked too much and slept poorly, his dreams filled with equations. His colleagues described him as brilliant but distant. His students spoke of him with respect and fear. He had no close friends. He spent his evenings alone reading scientific papers or sitting by his window, watching the world with the detachment of a man who had learned that observation was more enlightening than participation. What brought him to this gray English airbase was a recommendation from Captain James Morrison, a young officer who had attended one of Kellerman's lectures on acceleration physics before the war. In the headquarters building processing intelligence about air combat, Morrison had read the grim reports. American pilots were being outflown by Germans not because they lacked courage or possessed inferior aircraft, but because they simply did not understand something fundamental about the physics of aerial combat. Morrison thought of that lecture. He made a recommendation. Within 48 hours, Kellerman received a telegram. Within another 48 hours, he was on an aircraft heading to England. What he observed in the first week paralyzed him. Gun camera footage showed the moment when American pilots would execute standard maneuvers designed to position themselves behind their German opponents. Logical, predictable. Then the German fighter, a Messerschmitt 109, sleek and lethal, would respond with something that seemed to defy physics. The German pilot would push the nose down slightly while pulling back hard on the stick, creating a maneuver American pilots called a flick roll or snap roll. The aircraft would rotate violently, as though tumbling from the sky. But it didn't crash. The German would complete the rotation and suddenly be behind the American, closing in for a killing burst. And then the American would disappear from the film. No explosion, no indication of damage, just vanishment. Kellerman would later learn this was the euphemism pilots used for blacking out, consciousness lost, as blood drained from the head under gravitational forces, the pilot unable to see or respond while the German flew in unchallenged and opened fire. Kellerman watched this happen 4 times in different films, always the same outcome. A weapon they did not understand. A tactic based on knowledge of forces and acceleration and how to maneuver an aircraft in 3 dimensions while maintaining consciousness. That night, Kellerman sat in a cold office filled with the smell of cigarette smoke and machine oil. Using technical manuals and acceleration data obtained from the base library, he began writing equations. Page after page filled with calculations of centripetal acceleration, relationships between bank angle and gravitational forces, the physiological limits of consciousness under extreme acceleration. By 3 in the morning, understanding began to crystallize. The human body can withstand vertical acceleration up to about 6 gravities before consciousness fails. The German flick roll was not magic. It was a solution to a physics problem. By manipulating bank angle and angle of attack while using the aircraft's momentum, the German pilot could reposition the aircraft while maintaining consciousness through forces that seemed extreme, but which were actually distributed in ways the human body could withstand. Kellerman filled a 3rd notebook. By dawn, he had the framework for an understanding. He had discovered what was happening at the level of physics. That was the first step. The second step, teaching it to pilots who had been trained only through demonstration and fear, would prove infinitely more difficult. But Kellerman did not know this yet. He knew only that he had found a pattern, a principle, a truth hidden within the chaos of air combat. And for the first time in his solitary life, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with possessing knowledge that could keep men alive. Kellerman presented his findings to Colonel Harrison at 800 hours. The office was sparse: wooden desk, canvas chairs, a map of Germany marked with red circles indicating Luftwaffe bases. Outside, American fighters warmed up for morning patrols, their engines creating a mechanical roar. Kellerman stood at an easel, holding a wooden pointer that felt awkward in his hands, speaking in the measured tones of a man accustomed to lecturing undergraduates. He explained gravity as acceleration. He explained how bank angle and airspeed combine to create multiple gravities of force on the pilot's body. He explained the stall, not as a phenomenon to be feared, but as a tool to be understood. And he explained the flick roll not as mysterious German brilliance, but as applied physics. The Germans have discovered a way to maneuver that appears to produce extreme accelerations, Kellerman said, drawing diagrams with careful precision, but which actually distributes forces in such a way that blood pressure in the head is maintained. The key is understanding that acceleration is not purely vertical. If the aircraft is rotating, if forces are being applied across multiple axes, the centrifugal force is applied to the body in directions that are constantly changing. The blood has less time to pool. Consciousness is maintained. Colonel Harrison, a man in his 50s with the skepticism of a practitioner who had flown fighters in the previous war, listened. "Can you teach them?" "I can teach them to understand why they can do it. Understanding will make the difference." Within a week, Kellerman had access to 47 pilots in a classroom. They sat in rigid chairs, nervous about this unprecedented assignment. What they encountered was not what military training usually provided. Instead of demonstration and repetition, they received education. Kellerman began with Newton's first law written on the chalkboard. An object in motion tends to remain in motion unless acted upon by an external force. He made them understand that their aircraft obeyed these laws, that every maneuver was an application of these principles, that if they understood the principles, they understood the limits. If they understood the limits, they survived. Over 3 days, Kellerman demonstrated with tennis balls and buckets of water. He showed how centripetal force worked. He showed how acceleration affected the human body. He created anatomical drawings showing how blood pooled during high-G maneuvers, how the heart struggled to pump against pressure, how consciousness failed when blood could not reach the brain. One pilot named James from Tennessee asked how this helped him shoot down German fighters. Kellerman smiled. "Soon," he said. By day 4, Kellerman moved into the specific physics of aircraft. He taught them to calculate G-forces. He taught them the relationship between airspeed, bank angle, and forces acting on their bodies. He taught them the stall not as something to fear, but as something to understand, a state that could be entered deliberately and exited deliberately with knowledge. He taught them that the flick roll was not a mystery. It was physics. It was mechanics. It could be controlled. It could be mastered. "The Germans are not better pilots," Kellerman said slowly, looking across the faces of young men trying to comprehend. "They are smarter. They understand that flying is not an art. It is physics, and physics can be taught." By day 10, Kellerman was ready for practical evaluation. He had created training materials, laminated cards with key equations, breathing diagrams explaining muscular techniques for forcing blood into the head during high-G maneuvers, visual guides showing correct angles for various maneuvers. These would be distributed to other squadrons, but first came the test. Kellerman explained the breathing technique slowly. Pilots would need to contract the muscles in their abdomen and legs, forcing blood back into their heads during extreme maneuvers. He made them practice on the ground, tense, release, tense, release, until the motion became automatic. He explained what to expect psychologically: the disorientation, the fear, the temptation to give up. He explained that understanding would help them survive those moments. "You will be terrified," he said simply. "This is normal, but you will understand what is happening, and understanding is a weapon." The following morning, pilots were scheduled for practical training. Kellerman did not fly. He remained on the ground, watching the first Mustang climb toward the sky. James from Tennessee was in that cockpit. Kellerman stood with Colonel Harrison, both men silent, both understanding that what happened in the next hour would determine whether theory could become practice, whether understanding could overcome fear, whether one physics teacher could change air combat through equations and breathing techniques, and the courage of young men willing to trust in knowledge they did not fully comprehend. The first pilot was James. His Mustang climbed to 15,000 feet above the North Sea. His wingman maintained distance, filming with a gun camera. In the cockpit, James felt cold despite his sheepskin and canvas. The oxygen mask was uncomfortable. The controls were responsive. His radio frequency was set to training channels. Kellerman's voice came through, calm and authoritative. "Execute the flick roll we discussed. Airspeed 375. Remember the physics. Respect the forces." James took a deep breath. His hands trembled on the control stick. He had rehearsed this 100 times in his mind. He understood the theory, but theory and practice existed in different universes. He was about to discover which one was real. He pushed the stick forward slightly, reducing angle of attack. Then simultaneously, he pulled back hard on the stick and kicked the rudder hard to the left. The aircraft responded with violence that seemed to come from outside normal physics. Wings twisted, nose rotated, sky and sea exchanged places. The G-meter read 8 gravities. His vision tunneled. He felt blood draining from his head, weight in his chest, pressure threatening consciousness. Then the aircraft completed rotation. The maneuver was finished. The nose pointed in a completely different direction. James had intentionally stalled the aircraft, rotated it around its longitudinal axis, and recovered in the opposite direction from where he began. He remained conscious, he could see. Tunnel vision, yes, but consciousness persisted. "I'm still conscious." His voice came through the radio. "Yes," Kellerman replied. "You have executed a maneuver that seemed impossible because it violated intuition, but it did not violate physics. You remain conscious because you understood physics. The forces were distributed in ways your body could withstand. Repeat the maneuver." James executed it again. Easier this time. The shock of the unfamiliar had lessened. He could feel the aircraft responding, could sense the stall transition into rotation, could feel forces acting on his body. And he remained conscious through it, his mind and body adapting because they understood what was happening and why. Over the next hour, 38 of 47 pilots successfully performed the maneuver. 37 remained conscious. 5 blacked out briefly but recovered as they reduced G-loading. 4 refused to attempt the maneuver, fear overcoming instruction. But most importantly, most pilots reported the same revelation: understanding. The maneuver was not mysterious, it was not magic. It was mechanics, controllable, masterable. Most importantly, it could keep them alive. That evening, Kellerman sat in the officers' club nursing whiskey he did not particularly enjoy. Pilots celebrated with intensity of men who had stared into the abyss and discovered it had rules, patterns, could be negotiated through knowledge and discipline. Their voices carried loud with joy and camaraderie and shared experience of pushing through fear. Colonel Harrison joined him, placing a hand on Kellerman's shoulder. "You've created something important here, Doctor. Question is, can it be taught to enough pilots in time to matter?" "Yes," Kellerman replied. "Given logistics and training infrastructure, we can train pilots in fundamentals in approximately 3 weeks. By September, 500 trained pilots. By year's end, potentially 2,000. And will they remember it? Will they apply it in combat?" "That," Kellerman said slowly, "is something I cannot calculate. Knowledge is one thing. The will to apply it under extreme stress is another. But I believe the odds will favor them." The system could be taught. Kellerman spent the next month creating condensed training materials, laminated cards with key equations, breathing diagrams, visual guides showing correct angles for maneuvers. These materials were distributed to other squadrons. Within 2 months, over 200 American pilots had been trained. Within 4 months, the number doubled. Kellerman's equations became ubiquitous in fighter squadrons, found in flight suits pinned to briefing room walls, studied obsessively by young men trying to understand principles that might keep them alive. The effect on combat was immediate and dramatic. American pilots began surviving encounters that would have previously meant death. More than survival, they began winning. Casualty rates dropped precipitously. In August 1943, Americans were shot down at approximately 1-to-1 ratio with Germans, sometimes worse. By December 1943, the ratio had shifted. For every American lost, 2 German fighters were shot down. By spring 1944, American pilots were shooting down Germans at rates suggesting a fundamental shift in aerial combat capability had occurred. The turnaround was not solely attributable to Kellerman. The P-51 Mustang was proving excellent. American training improved. Tactics evolved. But Kellerman's understanding of physics of high-G maneuvers was the catalyst that integrated all improvements into a coherent system. Pilots who had previously been limited by fear of blacking out could now push aircraft to its limits. American fighters operating at limits proved superior to German fighters operating within conventional physiological constraints. Kellerman received commendations. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel, a title he carried with bewilderment, a man who still thought of himself as teacher, not warrior. The uniform sat strangely on his frame. He was invited to lecture at other bases, first England, then North Africa, then America. He watched his system expand, watched pilots in different squadrons, different countries, different contexts apply principles he had codified, and with each success, with each pilot who came back from mission alive, who reported using flick roll to escape, who used breathing techniques to maintain consciousness during 9G maneuvers that would have rendered him unconscious months earlier, Kellerman felt not satisfaction, but responsibility. He had given these men knowledge, weaponized knowledge, knowledge that carried costs extending beyond individuals. It extended into lives of German pilots who would die because American pilots now understood physics better. It extended into families never reunited because pilots failed applying knowledge correctly, had pushed too hard, understood physics but lacked discipline to operate within its constraints. But cost was paid in multiple currencies. In March 1944, Colonel Harrison appeared with a report. 6 pilots trained in Kellerman's system had died in a single engagement over Germany, not from technique failure, from overconfidence. They had pushed aircraft and bodies beyond described limits, assuming understanding gave invulnerability, had flown into traps laid by more experienced German pilots. American pilots attempting flick rolls and snap turns had overextended themselves. Attention focused on maneuvers and physics, missing larger tactical picture. German pilots herding them into positions where their knowledge and aircraft performance were negated by superior numbers and positioning. They died because they knew too much and weren't experienced enough to know what they didn't know, Harrison said, and Kellerman heard accusation in his voice. They died because they were pilots and this is a war, Kellerman replied, voice steady, though something fractured inside. They died with more knowledge than they would have had. They died having lived longer than they might have lived without that knowledge. That is all mathematics promises. Mathematics cannot promise that knowledge overcomes all obstacles. It can only promise knowledge is better than ignorance. The mathematics did not stop. Pilots kept flying. Techniques kept being refined. By D-Day in June 1944, Kellerman's system had been integrated so completely into American fighter tactics that it was invisible. Pilots no longer thought of themselves as following a physicist's precepts, but simply following best practices of survival. Deaths continued, but at lower rates than would have occurred without knowledge. Kellerman attended memorial services. He listened to names of pilots he had trained, pilots who understood physics but were shot down anyway, by enemy fire, accident, random chance governing warfare. Each name was a failure in abstract sense, proof that understanding was necessary but insufficient. that physics could explain how to survive, but could not guarantee survival. By war's end in Europe, Kellerman's training system had been applied to approximately 3,000 pilots. 92% completed at least one full tour of combat operations. In comparable groups trained without physics knowledge, completion rate had been 68%. The statistical difference represented approximately 700 pilots who survived because they understood physics. 700 pilots returning home, building post-war lives, creating generations that would not have existed without Kellerman's knowledge. Yet Kellerman did not think in terms of lives saved. He thought of pilots who had not survived, whose names were read at ceremonies, whose absence at reunions was permanent reminder of knowledge's limits and human frailty's vastness. By May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Kellerman stood in the same office where Colonel Harrison had asked if he could teach pilots to survive. The office was identical, but everything else had changed. Kellerman was gaunt, hair completely white, hands possessed slight tremor that doctors could not fully explain. The weight of 2 years of knowing his equations had contributed to thousands of deaths. Both American pilots who pushed too hard and trusted in knowledge too much, and German pilots who died because Americans learned to think, learned to apply physics to staying alive, settled into his bones with permanent weight. The war in the Pacific continued, but Kellerman's system had already been transmitted to Pacific commands. Japanese pilots, mostly lacking structured flight training that Germany possessed, were dying at incomprehensible rates. American pilots understanding physics met Japanese pilots operating on instinct and courage, and result was predictable as gravity itself. Japanese pilots were losing at rates they could not sustain. War in the Pacific was being decided, in part, by application of physics to aerial combat. Kellerman was offered position directing entire Strategic Air Command training program. He declined. Offered professorship at MIT focusing on applied aeronautical physics. He declined that as well. Instead, he submitted resignation from military and requested return to Princeton. By September 1945, he was back, walking familiar campus paths, returning to his laboratory, attempting to resume a life interrupted by war that he found he could not fully re-enter. Colleagues welcomed him as hero. University offered emeritus status. Newspapers wanted interviews. Publishers wanted books. Kellerman declined all offers. Instead, he returned to original research, study of objects in motion, fundamental forces governing the universe. He published papers making no mention of military application. He lectured to undergraduates about physics in pure mathematical language, divested of consequence, emptied of blood. He taught advanced aeronautical physics, but steered conversation away from military applications whenever students raised the topic. He became known as brilliant but distant, a man clearly marked by something but who chose not discussing what that mark signified. In personal life, Kellerman remained solitary. He had not married again. He lived in small house at Princeton's edge, filled with books and private research. He attended faculty functions but left early. He ate lunch alone. He spent evenings reading or working on theoretical physics problems with no practical application, problems existing purely for satisfaction of understanding them. Colleagues occasionally tried including him in social activities. Kellerman consistently declined. Eventually, people stopped asking. He became something of legend. Physicist who changed air combat, who saved thousands of lives, who spent remaining years in academic obscurity publishing papers almost nobody read addressing problems of such rarefied theoretical nature. Their relevance to anything real was highly questionable, but in classified files eventually declassified, in training manuals that pilots studied for generations, in textbooks on aeronautical physics incorporating Kellerman's discoveries as basic principles rather than innovations, his legacy persisted. Techniques he developed became standard. Understanding that flight was physics became foundational. Pilots who trained using materials derived from his system, pilots who never knew his name, owed their lives to a man who spent war years explaining how to stay alive in environments designed to kill. Kellerman died in December 1962, alone in his house surrounded by books and papers and accumulated evidence of a life spent pursuing understanding. He was 81. His death went largely unnoticed by general public. Obituary in the Times was brief, mentioning aeronautical physics but not military applications. Few understood that the man they read about had fundamentally altered nature of aerial warfare, had been responsible for shift cascading through military doctrine and pilot training for decades. University held memorial service. A few colleagues attended. Some former students, now successful physicists, came to pay respects. No one spoke extensively about his wartime work, as though collective agreement existed to leave that chapter unexamined. For pilots he trained. For pilots training next generations using materials derived from his system. For military institutions that codified his discoveries into standard procedures, Kellerman's impact was profound and permanent. American air superiority, proving decisive not only in World War II but in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts following, was built partly on foundation that a physics teacher from Princeton provided in cold classroom in East Anglia in 1943, when he stood before young men and explained that air combat was not mystery, but physics problem that could be understood and mastered through knowledge and discipline. His final letter to a young physicist captured his legacy. The universe does not care about our intentions. It responds only to our understanding. Every discovery, every principle we uncover, these become tools. Tools can build or destroy. The physicist cannot choose what the world does with his knowledge. He can only choose whether to seek understanding or hide from it. Choose to understand. The alternative is ignorance, which is the only true failure.